Hello and welcome everyone to today's session delivered to you in conjunction between the Bribery Prevention Network and the Trust Ethics and Governance webinar series from the University of Queensland. My name is Sarah Kelly. I am an Associate Professor in the Business School and the Law School at the University of Queensland, and I'll be moderating today's webinar, which I think you'll all agree is a very important topic, very relevant and a timely topic, given the landscape business, particularly SMEs in Australia and operating overseas as well, are living at the moment around increasing compliance, for instance, and needs for that compliance and adherence to relevant regulation, which is ever evolving, of course. And understanding how to actually, comply with the corporate crime, anti-corruption, bribery requirements that are coming through. And most importantly, overseeing and building and mitigating against any unethical cultures that can creep in around this very important compliance. So first today, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we are meeting today. From my perspective, I am delivering from home here. For those of you in lockdown, I can commiserate even though we are in Brisbane, but I am at home today. From Moreton Bay region and Stradbroke Island region, where it is the Quandamooka country. And I'd like to, on behalf of UQ, pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognise their very valuable contributions to Australian and global society. So first up, just a bit of housekeeping in this virtual world in which we are delivering now. Many of you will be familiar with this, but just in case you're not, I might remind you, firstly, you may use the chat function today, particularly to share links and documents and various resources. We will be using that in particular as well to help you out as we go through the webinar. But for Q&A, we'd really request that you actually use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens in Zoom, and I'll be monitoring that Q&A from time to time, collating that for a Q&A session towards the end of the webinar after each of our speakers present around their themes. The other thing I'd like to just mention too, that you'll notice we've closed captioning enabled to make this webinar a lot more accessible to all viewers. So if you'd like to turn these on or off, you can do so by clicking the live transcripts button below and following the prompts. So I would like to just mention the presenters today, from which we've sourced our fantastic speakers, and it really is a terrific, knowledgeable panel here today. Firstly, thank you from the Bribery Prevention Network, I should say, a national network and international network that is absolutely extraordinary. The BPN, as it's also known, is a collective action public-private partnership that brings together peak government, corporate, civil society and academic organisations with the shared goal of supporting Australian businesses, particularly SMEs, to prevent, detect and address bribery and corruption and to promote a culture of compliance. Through its initiatives, the BPN is creating more informed and compliant supply chains and supporting SMEs exposed to bribery risks to navigate Australia's evolving bribery laws. Secondly, I would like to mention the Trust Ethics and Governance Alliance, of which I'm one of the co-leaders with one of my colleagues, Professor Nicole Gillespie, and well coordinated and supported by Dr. Shannon Colville as well, who is online today, I know. The Trust Ethics Governance Alliance brings together experts from across University of Queensland, especially from the Business School and the Law School, to help address complex and rapidly evolving challenges relating to trust ethics and governance. And it's through our research, partnerships and executive education that we bring evidence-based, robust insights that help industry, government and not-for-profit organisations understand and manage these trust ethics and governance issues. And our thought leadership brings new perspectives that challenge traditional governance approaches, and we encourage research-informed debate. So it really is our pleasure to be partnering with the Bribery Prevention Network today. Now it's my pleasure to very briefly, and I feel like I'm not doing their bios and extraordinary experience around this topic and beyond justice, but just to save time, because I'm conscious of the very complex and interesting discussion we're about to have, I would refer you to the bio links that you'll be able to access through the program and the chat. But just briefly, I will introduce Andrew Walter, who is the first secretary from the Integrity and Security Division of the Australian Government Attorney General's Department. So welcome, Andrew, today, and we'll be starting with Andrew in just a minute. But first, I'll just introduce the rest of the panel. Liang Tang, who is the Executive Vice President and General Counsel and Company Secretary of Oceana Gold. Welcome, Liang, and thank you for your time as well today. Also, I'd like to introduce Gemma Aiolfi, and Gemma, I understand, is dialing in from the UK. I think I'm correct, Gemma, in saying that. And Gemma's role is as Head of Compliance, Corporate Governance and Collective Action at the Basel Institute of Governance, which she did help establish alongside Professor Mark Pease, the former chair of OECD Working Group on Bribery. And last but not least, one of my colleagues and members of the Trust Ethics and Governance Alliance, and heading it up from the point of view from the UQ Law School, is Dr. Radha Ivory, who is a senior lecturer in law and a specialist around some of the topics that you'll be talking about today, and other topics as well in things like international law and governance more broadly. So welcome, Radha, as well. First up, I'd like to welcome Andrew. And Andrew, just to prompt you with a couple of the themes and introduce the themes that you'll be talking about today, I'd first like to just prompt you with a couple of the questions. What are adequate procedures, and what is the relationship between adequate procedures and corporate culture, as we've mentioned? So it's a really interesting relationship there we'd love to hear about from you. And secondly, what is the government's role in regulating corporate behaviour and driving prevention of corporate misconduct? So thank you, Andrew. I'll hand it over to you for the next 7 to 9 minutes on the clock.
I'm being timed. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for the introduction. A big thank you to the Bribery Prevention Network and also to UQ for organising this session. If I can just acknowledge also the people, the Ngunnawal people from the beautiful lands on which I'm currently based in Canberra, and acknowledge my fellow panelists who, an extraordinary group of individuals. I feel quite humbled to be part of this panel. So I might address those prompting questions, but kind of in the reverse order from which they were asked. So governments, of course, have had a long interest in regulating corporate behaviour, whether that be in the interests of protecting investors or other market participants, or in addressing externalities such as pollution or other environmental harms. While regulating corporate behaviour is, of course, not new, the way in which government is looking to do this has begun to shift in some interesting ways in the last decade. So in particular, and what I want to address today, is governments in many countries are putting a greater emphasis on prevention and looking to sanction not just unlawful conduct, but failing to prevent that conduct from occurring in the first place. And I think there's a couple of reasons for this. And firstly, and I think it's a point, we kind of accept but don't think about terribly much, government has long been the risk taker of last resort for our societies. So it's easy to think of global examples such as the GFC, where governments had to step in aggressively to prop up the financial sector. However, we can see this on a much smaller scale as well. So here in Canberra, for example, the government purchased and demolished homes riddled with asbestos, installed by a long-defunct insulation business. It's obviously far cheaper to prevent these kinds of messes than to respond to them when they occur. And of course, that's not to talk about the human side of those events either. Secondly, I think we have a far more sophisticated understanding of how business contributes both positively and negatively to the state of the environment, the realisation of human rights, and to government corruption as three examples. We no longer think of these as problems for governments to solve. They are problems that need a contribution from everyone, and we take collective action. And when we do take collective action, everyone benefits from them. I think bribery and corruption, the main topic here today, are good examples of this. So preventing bribery and corruption is a shared goal of business, governments, and civil society. At the risk of stating the obvious, preventing bribery and corruption makes good business sense. Australian businesses are significant global investors, and strong anti-bribery policies and frameworks improve Australia's investment opportunities overseas. They ensure a level playing field and fair competitive conditions for our businesses. Preventing bribery and corruption is also a moral imperative. So when businesses invest and build in local communities, it should not leave those communities worse off. Preventing bribery and corruption goes hand in hand with creating the right conditions for social and economic growth and respect for human rights. So a key development in the area of bribery has been the emergence of so-called failure to prevent offences. So put simply, if an associate of a business, for example, an employee, engages in bribery and the business does not have adequate procedures in place to prevent such conduct, then the business itself may be found to have committed a criminal offence. So the UK has had a failure to prevent offence since 2010, and legislation that would introduce a similar offence in Australia is currently before the Parliament. So when we talk about adequate procedures, we're referring to the steps that a business should be taking to achieve prevention. So my department, the Attorney General's Department, has developed draft guidance on what adequate procedures should generally look like in anticipation of the passage of the new offence. This is still available on our website, and there's also submissions from stakeholders about changes we might make to those guidelines, which we're continuing to work through. So adequate procedures include undertaking risk assessments and due diligence that take into account the particular bribery and corruption risks that arise in the country or industry in which a business operates. This includes conducting initial and ongoing due diligence with respect to business relationships, especially relationships with third-party intermediaries who are based overseas. Businesses should also ensure they are providing avenues for employees and other associates to raise concerns and report suspected misconduct. This is often the best way of detecting potential corruption risks and addressing them before they become more serious. Significantly, adequate procedures will only be effective if there is a positive corporate culture. So this means fostering a robust culture of integrity in which bribery and corrupt conduct is never acceptable, and there is a genuine commitment to compliance, speaking up, and ongoing monitoring and review. Having said all that, which all sounds nice and scary, this is really about basic risk management. We want companies to be assessing the risks that they face in respect of people committing bribery offences, and then put in place proportionate procedures to address it. And obviously that's going to vary from company to company, and it's going to vary from depending on what the risk profile is for the activities being undertaken by that company. I thought I just might turn to the question of why we kind of think companies should be acting now on this, even though we haven't got our own Australian failure to prevent offence yet. So we think there are good reasons, particularly for those companies operating offshore, to think about adequate procedures now. The obvious reason is it's just good business. However, it's also important to note that business with a poor prevention culture can already be exposed to criminal and other forms of liability. For example, under Australia's criminal laws, companies can be liable for misconduct by their employees if their corporate culture encouraged or tolerated the employee's non-compliance. In the foreign bribery context, enforcement of Australia's existing regime is becoming ever more effective and has led to some pretty significant pecuniary penalties being imposed against companies. For example, the prosecution of Securency and Note Printing Australia for foreign bribery resulted in pecuniary penalties exceeding $21 million, the largest ever ordered in Australia. There are also compliance obligations that arise under foreign regimes, notably anti-bribery and corruption laws in the UK and the US, which had broad extraterritorial reach. As already mentioned, the UK has had a failure to prevent offence since 2010. Australian companies conducting at least part of their business in the UK can be liable under that offence. The extraterritorial application of the US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is also well known. Any Australian companies that conduct part of their business in the US, issue securities in the US, or employ US citizens can be liable under US bribery offences. In short then, businesses that implement adequate procedures are more likely to meet existing corporate culture and due diligence requirements in Australia, as well as those set by foreign jurisdictions. So I might leave my comments there, Sarah, but look forward to any questions.
Thanks very much, Andrew. That was a fantastic way to introduce this topic, particularly from the regulator's perspective, the government perspective, but also from very much, I think, and it's great to hear a common sense perspective where what I'm hearing is it really requires collective action in close partnership among government, businesses and society to prevent bribery and corruption issues. And I think secondly, understanding that this, the failure to prevent in addition to the unlawful conduct itself is something that business needs to be considering now, despite not having it in place yet in Australia. And it's not only a question of regulation, as you mentioned, it's very much a question around ethics and morality in place. So some really interesting points there. And I think it leads in very well to our next presenter, Liang Tang from OceanaGold. Liang, we welcome you. And around the themes in particular from the business perspective, the industry perspective, how is industry preparing for new adequate procedural requirements that are on the horizon and are already in place in jurisdictions like the US and the UK, as we've heard from Andrew, such as the proposed failure to prevent offence? And secondly, to what extent do you find that culture and compliance approaches help manage bribery and corruption risks? So it's very much about the risk register from what Andrew has said, and those that may occur in the future and have yet to be discovered.
Thank you for the introduction and the questions, Sarah, and thank you to UQ and the Bribery Prevention Network, as well as the fellow panelists. It's a pleasure to be on this panel today. I have put together a short presentation just as a reference point for the viewers. In the gold mining industry, the World Gold Council, which OceanaGold is a member of, has in late 2019 developed a set of voluntary principles called the Responsible Gold Mining Principles, or the RGMPs, that set out a clear framework as to what constitutes responsible practices for gold mining. Elements of the adequate procedure requirements are captured within the RGMPs, especially in two principles. Principle 1 on ethical conduct, where companies that implement the RGMPs commit that they will conduct businesses with integrity, including absolute opposition to corruption. So specifically, Principle 1.2 requires the maintenance of a code of conduct that sets out compliance standards and requires the company to actively promote the code and continuously monitor compliance. The World Gold Council has also provided guidance to its members on the practical implementation of the RGMPs. So some of the examples given by the guidance on implementing Principle 1.2 include publishing and periodically reviewing the code of conduct, seeking formal acknowledgement of commitment to the code by employees, ensuring that there is a mechanism in place to conduct risk-based due diligence on third parties. And then there is Principle 1.3, where the RGMPs specifically requires those who prescribe to the principles to put in place controls to combat bribery and corruption. So examples of implementation include ensuring there is adequate guidance given to relevant staff on issues such as the giving and acceptance of hospitality, gifts, obtain acknowledgement from employees that the policy is understood and that they will be complied with, delivering of training, provision of the anonymous Speak Up reporting platform. And there is also Principle 3 on the management of supply chain, which addresses the concept of associates in the Combating Corporate Crimes Bill, where the companies who prescribe to RGMPs will require their contractors and suppliers to conduct their businesses ethically and responsibly as a condition of doing business. So specifically, Principle 3.1 discusses the need to adopt a supply chain policy and conduct risk-based monitoring compliance. Examples given by the guidance for implementation include ensuring supply chain policy is readily available for staff to see throughout the business, and especially by the procurement team. For monitoring of existing suppliers, perform periodic risk-based supply audits, either by the company's internal auditors or an independent audit firm, and set up periodic meetings with the suppliers to discuss performance. Another example is embed understanding of the supply chain policy with local suppliers by providing briefings to them and local language translations. The last thing I want to mention with regards to the RGMPs is that the principles are focused on practical implementation and not just a paper program, and they have the guidance to help the companies with that implementation. Companies implementing the RGMPs will be required to obtain external assurance from a third-party independent assurance provider. And as part of the assurance process, the assurance provider needs to have an understanding from the management, including those at site level, of mechanisms in place for things like communication, training, monitoring, etc. So moving on to Oceana Gold's program. Next slide, please, Sarah. As part of our commitment to the RGMPs and focus on continuous improvement, Oceana Gold will be commencing a review of our anti-bribery and corruption compliance program later this year. But first, a quick look at our approach to improve compliance programs. The approach involves, first and foremost, ensuring that we have leadership commitment to support the program, and then understanding of our risks, building internal controls to mitigate those risks, developing communication and training programs so people can understand our expectation and controls, and then lastly, putting in place risk-based monitoring and oversight. We have recently adopted this approach, which reflects the general principles of the adequate procedures guidance, as well as other international regulator guidance related to compliance programs. Next slide. So there are two aspects of the compliance program I want to talk about today. First is the responsible supply chain program, which we are currently developing. This program is targeted at our suppliers and contractors and are planned around Principle 3 of the RGMPs, which I discussed earlier. The full program is a long-term body of work that will take place over a number of years to fully implement and embed. And the program is intended to cover the supplier lifecycle, which is before, during, and post-contract execution. So before contract, it will involve things like assessment of inherent risk of the supplier, for example, an assessment of the jurisdiction in which the supplier operates in. It will involve due diligence questions, and then an assessment of the actual risks pertaining to that supplier. So for example, does the contractor that we're talking about, do they engage with government officials as part of the work with Oceana Gold? And then communication of the supplier code, inclusion of compliance obligations in supply contracts. Once the contractor is engaged, we'll be looking at onboarding training to the contractors, a risk-based supplier audit, and monitoring of performance. And finally, upon termination of contract, a formal closure of risk assessment for the supplier. Now, the development of the entire program will require the compliance team to work closely with the operations team to ensure not only that it addresses business needs, but also that we have the site buy-in. Next slide. Second aspect of the compliance program is targeted at our internal stakeholders, including our leaders and our employees. Addressing Sarah's second question about culture and leadership. Culture and leadership is absolutely crucial in managing bribery and corruption risks. Leadership visibility sets the tone and expectation for the rest of the company about the right way to do things. As an example, I was recently involved in a major permitting project at the company, and from the get-go, the lead executive was very clear about the values to which the team needs to adhere to. So throughout the entire process, and especially during the times of significant challenges, the same messaging was reiterated, and it was all about you had to do it the right way. And everyone on the team was clear about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And during team discussions, when we try to resolve issues, you do hear people referring back to the set of values, and everyone's cognizant that we need to do things the right way. So I saw firsthand the importance of leadership influence on the actions in the rest of the team. On company culture, another thing that the compliance team has done was working cross-functionally with the people and culture team. So we've worked together on company values campaign. Recently, the people and culture team have introduced a culture pulse survey that they conducted, and the compliance team, we've added our own questions about speak up. We asked whether, questions like whether people feel safe to speak up, if they experience something wrong, whether they feel comfortable speaking to their supervisors, if they've made a mistake, or if they saw something that they're not sure about. So working collaboratively and leveraging off the work program of other teams has also given our team an additional avenue to implement and embed our compliance program. So I won't go through each of the elements of the business integrity program, but there are a few more things I would like to highlight. Under governance, the importance of a well-developed and regularly reviewed code of conduct and compliance policies and procedures. For us, we will also be doing a refresh of the Speak Up program as part of the code of conduct enhancement work. And the need to engage and collaborate with the business, co-creating tools and programs so they address the needs and challenges of the business. And it's crucial that the team is not working in silo. Then last but not least, the board's participation and interest in speaking up reports and the resulting investigations. Their review of the corporate risk register, compliance reporting to the board committees, which in our case is the governance and nomination committee, and the director's recognition and support to ensure that the function is well resourced. So the above are some of the things that we are currently doing, which we believe will help us preparing for the adequate procedures requirements and improving company culture, overall speaking. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Liang. That was absolutely fantastic. I really, really enjoyed that. And I would say it's probably the gold standard of compliance and taking that due diligence, as both you and Andrew have already mentioned. And then not only looking at internally the principles across the industry for gold mining, but also looking at supply chain and of course the leadership and culture. And actually, I think most importantly, I think we'd all business leaders, people involved in decision-making business would agree what are ethical values and what isn't. But unfortunately, in this environment and complex multinational environments, it's just not easy in practice to take those due diligence and, more importantly, the optics around the due diligence as well. And I think your principles clearly are a great standard there to look at, so thank you very much for that, Liang. And next I'd like to turn to the wonderful Gemma Aiolfi. Gemma, we welcome you as well. And you're going to be talking more on the theme of SMEs and how the anti-foreign bribery compliance looks like in the SME space, particularly around the advantages and challenges for SMEs seeking to manage these very significant risks through their internal controls. So it'll be an interesting comparison to what we've just heard around the gold mining industry. And, is there actually a difference really between culture and compliance for smaller firms? Thanks, Gemma.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Great pleasure to be here. I'm actually sitting in Switzerland, in Basel, so not too far away from the UK in Australian terms, but actually not quite over the channel and there, but rather on the edge of the Rhine River, and looking at the autumn weather that we've got here. It's turning cold, but a great pleasure to be with you, and thank you for the invitation. So just looking at SMEs then, let's have a quick regroup around what is an SME. So there is no international definition. They vary in size and complexity and business models, of course. And in Australia, the definition appears to be that a small business is one that employs less than 20 people or has a turnover of under $10 million per year. But SMEs are key in just about every market all over the world because they are generally the backbone of the country's economy. And this can also be said probably in Australia, where they make up well over 90%, 97% of all businesses, according to the statistics that I was looking at. They're also the driver of innovation in the economy, and they contribute to GDP by about 30%. And of course, then they're a significant employer. So it's interesting that when we talk about adequate procedures and laws and regulations, the focus is usually very much on multinationals, large companies, which of course have the financial power to pay significant bribes. But often what we see in the cases, as this is well known, is that the use of smaller companies or intermediaries to help facilitate those bribe payments increases, let's put it that way, the importance of small and medium-sized enterprises when it comes to preventing corruption. So what does this mean for compliance programs for such companies? Telling a company with maybe 24 employees or even 100 that it really needs an anti-corruption compliance program is a challenge. So why do they? What drives them to do that? And of course, the law is in fact a key element here. It also can be that the company itself realizes that selling overseas and exporting products may involve problems at the border on the countries to where they're sending their goods. Perhaps they're also working through representatives or distributors in markets and also see the risks of outsourcing some of their responsibilities that way, especially engaging with getting licenses in countries so that their goods can be distributed. Or perhaps they're subsidiaries of foreign companies in Australia that are subject to anti-corruption laws where adequate procedures are already in place. Or small companies have large customers, and those customers really want to see evidence of a compliance program and want to know what they're doing to prevent corruption in their operations. So these are all reasons that we've seen that drive smaller companies into thinking about how to implement a compliance program. And of course, the business reason is also very important. The World Bank has recognized that corruption is more likely to be devastating for a small company in terms of its survival than for a larger one. So looking at the advantages and challenges when it comes to developing and implementing a compliance program for a small or mid-sized company, the advantages that we know from talking to companies is that they know their businesses very well. They often don't have highly diverse business activities, and therefore are conversant with every element and stage of what they're doing, and so therefore can know their risks quite readily. So companies that might be headquartered in, let's say, Western Europe or in Australia that operate in countries or regions where corruption is a serious issue tend to know quite well where those issues arise within their supply chains, within their value chains. So basing their anti-corruption compliance program on those risks and looking at them really hard and thinking what they can do about them can be a real advantage of a small company. You have shorter, of course, reporting lines, shorter decision chains, and therefore possibly the opportunity to take action more readily. Recognizing what companies, small companies already have in place when developing their compliance program is often the way we start when we're advising or working with small and mid-sized companies. Often companies have systems and preventive mechanisms and controls, and they've had them in place for some time, but haven't necessarily linked them specifically and articulated that as being part of a compliance program. So here I'm thinking of financial controls, particularly having more than 1 or 2 pairs of eyes on outgoing payments, having clarity and rules around who can open, operate, and close bank accounts, making sure that incoming payments are only through bank transfers, conducting due diligence that's partly business oriented, but can actually be more than that, looking at the reputation risks of representatives who are perhaps working on behalf of the company abroad, and identifying the risks of customs authorities in the countries where goods are being exported to, and so on. We've heard a couple of times now of the basic elements of a compliance program, and clearly, as the first speaker said, identifying risks and managing risks is the key part, both externally to the company, in other words, the markets where you're operating, and also the laws and regulations, but also within the company's own activities. Developing guidance is key, due diligence on third parties, training and communicating, having a way of looking into the problems and investigating whatever goes wrong and fixing the failures and weaknesses are probably the key elements of an anti-corruption compliance program, put in informal language, if you will. I'd like to give a couple of examples of how this has actually worked for some companies. A couple of years ago, we were approached by a UK-based company, a very small company, only about 6 people, and they were developing software to be put in place in diesel engines in India. And this software was being piloted, being tested in a city's bus system, so it was being installed into the buses. And the company and its engineers went to the city and were doing this, and just about every person that they interacted with asked them for a small payment, for some sort of facilitation payment, as they're called. And the more senior people in the bus company asked for slightly larger amounts, and so on. The managing director of this company, who was also the owner of it, said, I really don't want to be doing this. I would like them to see the benefits of what we're trying to do. We're not killing off anybody's jobs. This will improve air quality and will improve the way the buses run. So they asked us what could they do. They'd been saying no, and then they'd started to face resistance from the people that they were working with in terms of cooperation. So we said, okay, one way to start to do this would be to think about what would be a very light touch approach to a compliance program that addresses corruption risks. So they wrote down in 10 principles, or 12 sentences, it turned out to be, what they stand for. In other words, a code of ethics. It doesn't have to be a long document, but it sets out clearly what their values are and how they operate as a business. This they could then share with the management of the city bus company. They started to explain why they don't want to make small payments and what it is that they really would like to see over time. This took quite a lot of discussions. They worked as well at the same time in thinking, how could they support the company, not only in selling, as it were, their products or piloting them there, but also upskilling the mechanics, talking about ethics, explaining what good business means, and creating the basis for a new mindset within everybody in that organization. So that was one example of cooperating and trying to think in realistic terms, what does a compliance program look like in the markets where we are operating? For small companies, knowing where to get started and wondering what competitors are doing, this can be a way of engaging in collective action. So here's another example that I'd just like to share with you very briefly in the time that I have. For the last 6 or 7 years, we've been working with mid-sized companies, 4 companies that build smelters. These companies actually, between them, have well over 40% of the world market in building smelters. So they're a significant global force, as it were. Because they're also competitors, it was obviously very important that they have a neutral facilitator. So that's the role that we play in all of this. But we are bringing together general counsels and compliance people from these companies, so they're also well aware of the antitrust and competition laws and regulations to which they're subject. The focus of all these discussions has been, over the years, what does good compliance look like, anti-corruption compliance in particular, for fair competition in the markets where these companies compete? Over the years, we have developed a memorandum of understanding between them. We have spent a lot of time talking in detailed terms, what does third-party due diligence look like for this industry sector? Where do risks arise, such as when an end customer, a government, in a country that is known for its corruption, starts indicating when it comes to payments that they want to do it through all sorts of interesting structures offshore? and how to resist those kinds of proposals from the end customer, even though it's a government and these companies are not enormous. So sharing and understanding what does lavish hospitality look like, and why this isn't a great idea now, and developing standards that everybody can get their hands around and implement has been the focus of this particular collective action. And I think it's an interesting model also for others that are thinking, how do we do this in practice? Just a couple of words on, is there a difference between culture and compliance in smaller companies? So one example that we've also worked on in the last year during lockdown was with the Norwegian bank, the investment management investor, the world's largest investor, in fact, in the world, and a group of pharmaceutical companies. And the aim of this group was to identify what are the indicators of an effective anti-corruption compliance program, because every company wants to know that their money is being well spent when they develop a compliance program. So we deliberated with these companies that are all quite sophisticated in terms of what they've been doing for the last few years in anti-corruption compliance. And they are also thinking closely about what is an indicator of effectiveness. And we also asked them at one point, if there was only one thing that they could actually identify, what would it be? And they all said, it's the culture. The culture is the most important element of an anti-corruption compliance program, as the previous speaker also mentioned. In other words, if you haven't got the buy-in of the board and the senior management, you're never going to get anywhere with implementing standards. So it's encapsulated in the phrase, the tone from the top, and it's all about leadership through behavior, actions, decisions that creates the culture in the approach to conducting business. It's reflected in values that are articulated in the code of conduct, and we hear about speak up as being an indication of culture. We've been talking to another very large organization and looking to strengthen their governance instruments. And we asked them, what does the culture feel like in your organization? And they almost all said there's a culture of fear of speaking out, fear of criticizing, fear of even asking questions or challenging management on things that look wrong. This is a terrible situation to be in, because we know that this is where disasters happen and where bad things are perpetrated. So the culture is a mixture of various elements, individual behavior, but also the industry and how the company within that industry sector behave. Do they break the rules? Do they tend to follow them? And also then within the organization itself, what is the actual or perceived culture? Within a smaller company, not surprisingly, the smaller the organization is, the more the culture is a reflection of the personal norms of the managing director or the CEO of the company, or perhaps the owner, but also the perception of these norms by individual employees. One last example, and then I'll stop. We were working with a mid-sized family-owned company that had been called out by its large customer. The large customer had noticed that it was being defrauded and wanted an investigation into this smaller supplier. And the smaller supplier turned to us to have some help with their investigation. And we started to look into what had been going wrong. And lo and behold, the company had in fact been scamming quite a few of their customers to increase and inflate their bills. And the people who were doing this, the employees, were doing it for the good of the company. They really genuinely thought that this is what the owners wanted. And they weren't putting the money into their own pockets. It was all flowing back into the company. The company owner, when we talked to him about what was going on in his company, was devastated, or he appeared to be, because he said that he trusted that his senior management were also sort of part of the family. And every time we raised examples of what had been going wrong and how it was happening, he kind of couldn't believe it, because he said, these people are my family, even though they were not blood relatives. At the end of it all, they paid back the money that they had taken from their main customer. They sacked a junior person, but the managing director and CEO of this company and the owner of the company couldn't bring himself to part with the senior managers who had also been part of this fraud, which sends a huge signal throughout the whole of the company as to what the behavior expectations are. So there was only so much advice we could give at that point, but it wasn't a great example. So is culture driven by the demands of customers? In this case, I thought it was an opportunity for the company to change because they had unearthed what had been going wrong at the behest of a customer. But at the end of the day, I don't think it worked in that particular case, even though the customer was extremely important to that company. But in other cases, I think it can help to push, but it requires multiple approaches, not only from customers, but also really strongly from the top of the organization and working with and listening to employees throughout. As I've said, I think collective action is a great way to help companies get started and to improve their anti-corruption compliance programs. And the Basel Institute has many, many examples in the database of collective action. It's called the B20 Collective Action Hub. It's a free resource. And if anybody's interested in collective action, we're here to give free advice. So we look forward to hearing from you on that. Thank you so much. I'll stop there. Hope I haven't exceeded the time too much.
Thanks very much, Gemma. Really great examples to bring to life some of the challenges and the drivers, I suppose, of SME compliance in this complex regime. So we really appreciate, those sorts of really in-depth insights and case studies. And a lot of what we're hearing again in the SME space is that tension, I suppose, between the cost of compliance and actually implementing the compliance in a business savvy way. But of course, there are business reasons, moral reasons, and legal reasons to comply. And part of that, or a large part from what we're hearing from you, is the education and close collaboration, once again, with various supply chain partners who may reside in jurisdictions that may not have exactly aligned values, for example. So that's probably the heart of it, that close collaboration and development of understanding of what is expected around the right ethical values. So regardless of legislation. So thank you, Gemma. I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to very speedily introduce one of my lovely colleagues, Dr. Radha Ivory. Radha, we're really looking forward to your perspectives and your incredible globally known expertise on the regulatory environment around these compliance approaches. So, some of the, how does it work? What are the relevant frameworks and structures there? And what does the research indicate, as far as you know, about the potential benefits and challenges of legislation in this space? Thanks, Radha.
Thanks. Excuse me. Before I start, apologies for my hoarse voice. Thank you to everyone. And it's a real honour, as others have said, to be a part of this panel today, collaborating with new colleagues at the Bribery Prevention Network, and also having the pleasure of re-engaging with former colleagues, Gemma, namely from the Basel Institute on Governance and the Institute on Collective Action. So the focus of my intervention today is the academic perspective on so-called corporate culture rules. So what I'll be doing effectively is reframing some of the insights from the other contributions in more academic terms and giving a perspective into why we have the rules the way that we have and what their advantages and potential challenges are, looking at the literature and examples of other countries. So corporate culture rules, otherwise known as holistic approaches to corporate liability, are a type of mechanism in corporate, especially corporate criminal law. They're distinctive because they make findings of law dependent on one or both of two factors. The first is the quality of a company's misconduct controls. That's maybe what we think of when we talk about adequate procedures. And the other are its patterns of social interaction, which reflect shared values or assumptions. And Gemma gave us a really vivid example there of the CEO who couldn't bring himself to change the culture within his company, and also the converse example of the people who are working with colleagues in India who could express their values and do that effectively. So corporate cultural approaches span both those internal controls and those more soft social aspects. I'll be treating them together for the sake of our talk. So culture approaches are found across many different legal systems. In some research that I did with our Basel colleague, Professor Mark Peet, in the early 2010s, we found a convergence among approximately 10 key OECD and non-OECD countries around these cultural approaches within corporate liability laws. They appear at different points in the legal process, however. So to take some common law examples, they can be a way in which companies are held liable, and that's the case under our Commonwealth Criminal Code. But they can also be a factor in determining the penalty imposed on a company, or whether a prosecutor makes available a negotiated settlement. So that's the approach taken in particular in the US federal law. They can also be an exception or a defence to liability, as we see with the UK's Bribery Act. All in all, corporate culture approaches are popular among policymakers. So what are the advantages? For lawyers, they help address the thorny issue of corporate conscience. How do you make a fictitious legal person possibly culpable or more or less deserving of punishment in a way that's persuasive in law? So traditionally, common law legal systems look to the individuals involved, either the high-level managers, the so-called directing mind and will of the company, or the lower-level employees who had nonetheless a kind of chain of the command connection to back to the corporate. Unsurprisingly, as I'm sure many people know, those approaches have been criticised as under and over-inclusive. So the US system, which uses that broad approach, is said to capture companies that do the right thing otherwise, and the UK approach, which is associated with the more narrow version, is said only to capture misconduct at the high levels of management. Neither of those positions get to the so-called to the problem also of rotten barrels, when you have a company, an organisation that systematically fails to control perpetrators over time. So cultural rules are a kind of Goldilocks position. They look at the conduct of multiple individuals, and they also look at how the company overall governs that sort of criminal risk. And Liang gave us a great description of what that looks like, in a really good case of compliance. So economists like corporate culture approaches because they see net gains to society from requiring corporations to police associated people. Corporations are a kind of gatekeeper. They have some advantages in a law enforcement context that is wrapped up with economic crime. So as we kind of heard with these previous presentations, they may be better placed to know when people have done the wrong thing, what sort of measures would prevent that kind of wrongdoing in the future, and how those preventive measures can be tailored to be least disruptive to business. That's probably the main economic argument, so I'll leave it there. It's also important to consider the social psychology perspective. The basic insight here is that good people do bad things in part because of the environments they find themselves. Organisations, specifically here corporations, can create opportunities and incentives for individual rule breaking. So they can generate informal norms that help people rationalise and neutralise the negative impact of their behaviour, and in so doing maintain a positive image of themselves while doing things that they would otherwise find reprehensible. So cultural approaches have many arguments in favour of them, but they also face some challenges. Other economists point to the problems of incentivisation. How do you get a corporation to do the right thing? Well, using that kind of rational actor model, they say that enforcement has a big part to play. But as we know, there are many barriers to enforcement in the corporate liability space. You've got to know that an offence was committed, you've got to be able to prove it with admissible evidence, and then you have to have a public interest in investigating given the costs involved in the crime. So some of these problems can be addressed through concessions for corporates that self-report or cooperate, but you also need to begin with a background risk of detection and enforcement that's high enough. So there's a kind of chicken and egg problem here. Then amongst legal sociologists, there are concerns that compliance approaches more generally can sometimes be counterproductive. Studying US anti-discrimination law, people like Lauren Edelman have found that companies tend to interpret compliance requirements in a way that is legalistic and least disruptive to their business. Regulators are influenced indirectly by corporate understandings of the law, and in doing, over time, there's an interaction between regulators and companies that leads to laws that are supposed to change corporate behaviour, ending up changing to reflect less than optimal practices of compliance control, so that otherwise, in other words, permit misconduct. Lawyers also have some concerns. These might be familiar to people, so I'll state them most quickly. There's a problem of proof. How do you prove to the criminal standard that culture enabled an offence? Then there's a problem of justice. Cultural approaches appear to deviate from traditional principles in the criminal process, especially when they're employed using things like strict or absolute liabilities and reverse burdens of proof. Then there are more amorphous but nonetheless important concerns around co-opting the private sector to do the state's dirty work of surveillance and enforcement. Those kind of concerns are likely to increase when we have more use of information technology and AI in this space. Finally, there are more theoretical reflections that cultural approaches are not just pragmatic responses to the world as it is, but actually reflections of how people think the world is. They are a reflection in this way of changing patterns of regulation that see a shift in responsibility for controlling society from government to the private sector and from the private sector to the individual. So all up, cultural approaches find advocates and critics in the academy, and the debates within the academy are important to why we have cultural rules, because they go to the supposed advantages in principle and on the company floor.
Hello, thanks very much, Radha. Sorry, there's just been a technical glitch there, but look, that was another really complimentary perspective on this very critical topic today. I am conscious of time. We have a lot of engagement online. Thank you very much to our audience for that. Obviously, our speakers have resonated and created a lot of interest. I know some of our speakers have been answering some of the Q&A. I do understand, Andrew, I think you had an answer to one of the questions, which was when we can expect a combating crime bill to come into force. Andrew, can you give us an update there?
Thanks, Sarah. Look, the bill is before the Senate. We have 2 Senate weeks left in 2021, which means 8 days. I don't think it's going to get on for debate this year. So we're off to, assuming we have sittings early next year, we've got an election coming up, then hopefully in those sittings. And just to be complete, the offence provisions and the amendments to the offence provisions commence 6 months after it goes through Parliament.
Well, thank you very much for that. That question's answered, and I understand a couple of the others have been answered online. So I think we have actually answered most of the questions we have for today, but of course, feel free to reach out to the Bribery Prevention Network or the Trust Ethics and Governance Alliance. Radha, I should thank you too. I haven't formally sort of given an overview there, but I think I'll draw your presentation in among everything we've learned today. And honestly, it's been extraordinary, the depth of insight and the breadth. When we look at your presentation on an update on the regulations and a really objective critical analysis of that existing framework with an overlay, and I found this really interesting, of the social science around it, and the fact that we have to remember that good people do bad things, and we've heard it across the board today, really. And that is one of the things at the heart of this discussion that business leaders, governments, not-for-profits and society more broadly needs to address in ensuring we don't have the incentives and the systems, the processes and the unethical leadership potentially or culture in organisations. And I think overall the common themes we've heard are collaboration, close co-creation, of this ethical environment and the setting of the expectations and standards, combined with, of course, really strong education and training internally and externally across contractors and supply chains, external audits, so important, and very practical measures in particularly SMEs and smaller organisations working together in a constant state of learning. So, to ensure what best practice is, that is also feasible practice, but adheres to compliance, of course. And I think at the end of the day, as Andrew started out mentioning, and I think every speaker has mentioned, it is about risk and due diligence, not just in a technical way, but of course that's important, but also in a cultural way and a very practical, common sense way. So I might leave it there and really thank you very much to all of our panelists today, Andrew, Liang, Gemma, and Radha. Your insights have been so valuable. Thank you everyone for attending today, and we appreciate your time.